David Brooks and Bill Kristol wrote that article about being for national greatness, I invited David Brooks, who now writes for the New York Times, to breakfast. I said, let me buy you breakfast if you tell me what national greatness means, because I don't understand it. If you put a gun to my head today, I couldn't tell you. I mean, he talked for half an hour. I couldn't tell you what he was talking about, what he meant by national greatness, and I couldn't pull it out from him, other than that people should derive their meaning in life not from their faith, their work, or their family, but from politics. That's not a widely held view on the center-right. It may be more popular on the left, but most people on the center-right derive their meaning in life from their family, their faith, their work, something that they do, and not from, gee whiz, the federal government's doing something really cool and we're all part of it. And that's what we're about. I think there is a false sense of accomplishment that the book covers, and that is because these people were on the right side of the struggle with the Soviet Union, eventually, not at first, but eventually, some people act as if that was the tipping point. I grew up in Massachusetts before emigrating to America, and in 1980, I worked on the Reagan campaign. We carried the election for Reagan in 1980 in Massachusetts. We carried 44 states for Reagan. I don't think Nebraska voters and Kansas voters decided to support Reagan's view of the nature of the Soviet Union and the nature of international Bolshevism because some intellectuals had written a series of magazine articles in New York City that they don't know anyone who knows anyone who know anyone who read it. There was an anti-Soviet movement. We worked on the anti-Soviet movement in South Boston when I was in 1980, and we talked to, guys from Czechoslovakia and Hungary and all sorts of Eastern European immigrants who were voting against the Democrats because they were anti-communist. And again, not because the neocons had sent them a letter saying it was now okay for them to be anti-communist. They had, oddly enough, been anti-communist for some time since their relatives or they had been kicked out of Eastern Europe. So make a list of the political accomplishments of the neocons. I don't think they won the Cold War. I think the modern Reagan Republican Party was there. A handful of Democrats who helped didn't turn the tide, didn't change the direction of the nation. Take a look, the Weekly Standard wanted to run Colin Powell for president. That didn't work out very well. There was a moment when they were running Gary Bauer. They were for McCain over Bush in 2000. When you go through a list of things that they wanted to do where they were not riding on the back of the elephant and saying, hey, aren't we up high and moving quickly, but things that they were actually working on, projects that they brought to the coalition alone. Maybe you could argue the decision to invade Iraq and occupy it. I think your argument that there were many other reasons for knocking off Saddam Hussein that were there. Some of the arguments for it were their own, and that's where I think the criticism can come, because why are we there and how long are we staying and what are we doing is a debate that the neocons grabbed a hold of. There were many good reasons to decide that Saddam Hussein was, ought to be knocked off, and I think that Cheney and Bush and a handful of people, absent the existence of neocons in the history of the world, might well have made that initial decision. So sometimes the neocons' enemies make them 12 feet tall, say, oh, they did all these things, and I read the left-wing publications, and I'm a neocon in their publications. I'm not, especially when I'm cutting taxes, so I'm not quite sure what that's all about. But this is not, so there's a problematic relationship that the neocons have with the modern Republican Party. They want to act sometimes as if, they write articles as if they're steering the elephant, and I'm not sure that that's actually historically been true, except in one case where I think they would perhaps not like to take credit for the way things worked out. And I guess I would suggest, in closing, that the modern Republican Party doesn't have a foreign policy, and I know the Nixon Center can and I believe will play this role, but right now doesn't have a center on foreign policy or defense in the way that, for instance, the National Rifle Association deals with gun issues. If a Republican wants to understand where the Second Amendment community are, they look to the NRA. I serve on their board, will be running for re-election next year, those of you who are life members. There's the National Right to Life Committee, that if you're wondering where people are, that has a leadership role in the party. Americans for Tax Reform works on asking people to commit not to raise taxes. So there are different groups that, if you want to talk about Social Security, you check what's Peter Ferrara happened to think. We don't have that on foreign policy. We don't have a center on a serious, strong national defense. There's not an NRA on national defense or foreign policy, and I think the voice of the Nixon Center can and should be moved towards that direction. And people tend to defer to experts in many cases if they don't know anything, and that's where some people have sort of, well, he seems to know what he's thinking, or says he knows what he's talking about, and that can be dangerous if there aren't enough voices out there, and they're not, if there aren't enough different voices out there to have competitive voices getting bad ideas knocked out by good ideas. So those are my thoughts. I mean, some of my best friends are neocons. I love to read John Podhoretz when he writes about theater in New York. I don't know anything about theater in New York. I don't want to learn anything because then I might disagree with John, but I really like reading him when he writes about that. But I think that they get blamed for a lot of things when they weren't in the room. Sometimes perhaps they take credit for things when they weren't exactly in the room. But the challenge on how they structured the occupation of Iraq and why we were there and what we do next and why, I think, has been problematic and not served the president well.
Thank you very much.
Well, I pretty much associate myself with what Grover just said. As a paleo who was in the Pentagon but happens to be Jewish and was called a neocon, welcome to the Jewish religion, yeah. Grover. That's nice to know you're part of us. I didn't know that. I have a lot of sympathy with Jacob's critique of the neocons, but I come out at the same place at the end, but I don't get there the same way. And I know Dimitri wanted me to talk a little bit about the Jewish element, which features so heavily in the book, and particularly the Holocaust element, so I'll address that. And really, in many ways, it's what the book doesn't say. And let's start with one of the so-called arch neocons. I think he's quoted more in the cited more in the index than anybody else, and that's Paul Wolfowitz. I ought to mention that just about everybody in that book is somebody I've known for about 30 years, unless they were too young. So I've known these folks for a very long time and disagreed with them equally as long, but, you know, you can disagree with people and still be their friends. Paul Wolfowitz, of all people, does not fit into the neocon, supposed neocon mold of looking at the world through the prism of Israel. I stood near, virtually alongside Paul when he was booed in, I think it was 2002, at a rally where he actually said some things about the importance of giving the Palestinians dignity in a real life. And he was booed. And this was far less public, but one time I was sitting with Paul. One of my responsibilities, although being the comptroller of the Defense Department, you wouldn't have thought it was, but one of my responsibilities was to be the fundraiser and troop raiser for Iraq and Afghanistan. I used to run around the world with this tin cup. Sometimes people dropped a couple of pennies in. Many times they said they'd given at the office. But one time I'm sitting with Paul, and he says to me, you know, Dov, when we're finished with Afghanistan and when we're finished with Iraq, we will now take up a collection for the Palestinians. That just doesn't fit with this image of Paul Wolfowitz as the arch neocon. Now, he's a complex guy, but it also means that how you look at the neocons may not be in a sort of unidimensional way. And to some extent, what Jacob has done is paint them that way. It also doesn't mention that the anomaly that there were other people, senior people in the Pentagon, apart from myself, who weren't neocons. Peter Rodman, whom you mentioned once, and actually came to the Pentagon from the Nixon Center, is certainly not a neocon. In fact, to this day, he still is proud to admit that he worked for that arch enemy of the neocons, Henry Kissinger. It also doesn't mention that probably the two most important advisors to Don Rumsfeld were not neocons. Bill Schneider, who may have been Don's first choice as Deputy Secretary of Defense, but for personal reasons he couldn't take the job, and he wound up, and still is, head of the Defense Science Board, and Steve Cambone, who was in many ways Don's most personal advisor before 2001 and throughout their career, and left right after Don did. Now, a lot of people think Bill Schneider's Jewish. He's not. And nobody thinks Steve Cambone is Jewish. So, again, you've got this kind of disconnect. And then if you actually go through the list of some of the more prominent policymakers, and I think this is where there's a distinction that Jacob doesn't make enough. He makes some of it, but he doesn't make it enough. The distinction between the policymakers on the one hand, the people who actually had to deal with the real world, and the intellectuals and the journalists on the other. The list of policymakers is pretty long. Bill Lutey, last time I checked, he wasn't Jewish. Jim Roach, who isn't mentioned at all, Secretary of the Air Force, card-carrying neocon for at least 25 years, if not longer. And you could go on and on. Zal Khalilzad, last time I checked, was a Muslim, actually. Again, unless we're having mass conversions here, the point is sort of irrelevant. And where the Jews dominated was on the intellectual side, and then the journalists. I mean, Jews are overrepresented on the op-ed pages of the major newspapers. You cannot pick up a Washington Post, a New York Times, an LA Times op-ed page without seeing at least one column, including today's, written by somebody who's Jewish. Okay, so if you have that, then you combine the intellectual side of the neocons with the journalistic side of neocons, and maybe you have something there. But one other point. If you want to think that somehow the neocons, Jewish or not, hijacked the president, you just don't know this president. This president, and I was with him in discussions that, I was one of his Vulcans, one of the 7 people that advised him from the beginning. I joined up in 1998, so I had a couple of years working with him during the campaign, and then 3 more years as one of his undersecretaries. When he makes up his mind, he makes up his mind. And that's that. And if you've ever served in the administration, you know that once the president's made up his mind, everybody else salutes smartly or gets out. He made up his mind about Iraq, not the neocons. And to talk about journalists, this is a president who claims he doesn't read a newspaper. So how much influence could they possibly have had? The Holocaust, very briefly. The only son of Holocaust, I happen to be the son of a survivor. A lot of my childhood friends were sons of survivors and daughters of survivors, and I mean people who had